The OG viewers among you will know I'm really fascinated by keyboards, and over the last couple of years I've been on quite the journey to find the ultimate keyboard. My day job is a software developer, and I really enjoy the process of optimizing my keyboard use when I'm coding with Vim. By the way, if you work in web design, you should definitely check out setseed.com, which is the product I've basically spent most of my working life building, iterating through various approaches to how best solve the problems faced by web designers, namely how do you say yes to your clients' requests for custom functionality at scale. Do get in touch with me or Chris over at setseed.com to learn more. In this video, I'm going to look in detail at the new Voyager keyboard from ZSA. And this is a very significant keyboard in many ways, and there's lots to look at. Now, I know a lot of people aren't actually aware that there are actually alternatives to the keyboard they use with their computer or the one that's part of their laptop. So I'm going to start by doing a little bit of a primer on custom keyboards. The keyboard design that the vast majority of people use that comes with computers and built into laptops is this standard QWERTY keyboard with a horizontal stagger in the rows. For someone who likes to find the optimum version of something, this is by all accounts a terrible keyboard design. The stagger makes no sense at all. It's not there for any ergonomic reason, and this can very easily be proved by looking at the offset between those columns and the fact that it's totally asymmetrical from your left hand to your right hand. And of course, having the keyboard fixed and flat means you're rotating your wrists down like this into this position, which is putting an awkward tension into your forearms. The other implication of having the rows on the keyboard all on the same level is that you might find that your wrists have to do this kind of thing to use that keyboard, and a lot of people find that a trigger for repetitive strain injuries too. And then as part of this standard keyboard design, you've got things like the symbol keys and the modifier keys, which are basically right on the outside of the keyboard, which forces you to do all kinds of weird contorted positions with your hands to do basic keyboard shortcuts. Of course, the real issue with these kinds of keyboards is they are just what they are. There's no customization. Sometimes you can tweak things within the operating system that you're working with, but if you then take your keyboard and put it on another machine, it's going to go back to its default settings, and that is very limiting. An entire community of people exists who are really passionate about avoiding these problems, and the keyboards they use are called custom keyboards. Now, once you get into this territory, there's really no limit on the variety and variation between the kinds of keyboards that people use, different numbers of keys, different layouts, and all kinds of different approaches. But the main theme with these is that they're all absolutely completely customizable. And obviously people get into this for different reasons, and they have different priorities in their customization journey. Some people might favor splitboard designs that allow for tenting and different kinds of size layouts according to what they want to do with those keyboards. And then there's the actual layout of the keyboard as well. So the normal layout is QWERTY. This is what is on your standard keyboard. And this means the keys are the same as they were on the old-fashioned typewriters, where there was a real need to prevent the hammers from jamming. So there is this idea that the layout was optimized to avoid that. Although I think there is actually some doubt that that is the reason that the QWERTY layout was actually designed, but it doesn't really make any difference as to why it came about, because if you look at this objectively using the data on sort of finger positions and the frequency of the keys used, it makes no sense at all. It doesn't prioritize your stronger fingers and your stronger key positions with the more common letters. And that's just the start of it. You've then got things like same finger bigram frequencies and all kinds of other metrics that you can use to evaluate how good a keyboard layout is. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point that changing to a custom keyboard does not necessarily mean you need to change away from QWERTY. Learning a new keyboard layout is really not for the faint-hearted. It takes a lot of effort, and it's really taxing mentally, and takes a lot of time and slows you right down while you're doing that. So it's definitely not something I'd recommend you jumping into without a good deal of thought beforehand. But the main point here is that all the other benefits associated with custom keyboards easily still make it worthwhile switching to a board like that, even if your intention is to stay using QWERTY. In terms of hardware, the vast majority of custom keyboards will use mechanical key switches, and these come in two main flavors: the MX style key switch and the chock style key switch. Now, the chock style key switch is a lot newer and it's a lot lower profile and allows for the keys to be slightly closer together as well. The MX switch hasn't really changed a great deal over the years, and a lot of people still use these, but for me they do just seem a little bit antiquated. They really are quite big, and you know, you're kind of bashing it. It feels a bit like a typewriter. It certainly doesn't allow for a keyboard to be very portable. Now, because the chock style switch is relatively new, it hasn't actually been used by very many mainstream keyboard manufacturers, and that's why the Voyager is so exciting, because it uses chock switches. Now, what most custom keyboards do is they will lose this idea of the horizontal row stagger, which is just a horrible thing and makes no sense, and actually makes learning to type really hard because of this asymmetry in the layout. There's no logic to it. Whereas a columnar or even ortholinear keyboard seems to me to make so much more sense. So ortholinear is where the keys are in just a fixed grid, and I think that can work quite well on very small layouts, and I've done that myself with some of my custom boards. But for a normal bigger keyboard like this, it is good to have that offset between the columns so that your little finger columns are a little bit lower down and easier to reach with your little fingers. Really though, of course, the main feature with these custom keyboards is their ability to be customized in terms of their layout. And one of the really significant things that allows you to do is work with layers. So we're kind of actually used to working with layers without really realizing. So the shift key will put your number row into essentially another layer where those keys will give you symbols instead of numbers. So that is, in simple terms, exactly how layers work. But with custom keyboards, the idea is that you can kind of use that concept on the whole keyboard so that you can really think in terms of reducing the size of your physical layout of keyboard, so you're not stretching your fingers so far. You can simply go to a different layer to get a key instead of stretching your finger. And that means you can make for a much more comfortable typing experience that's really optimized for the kind of things that you're doing with your keyboard. And the best thing about this customization is that with these kinds of keyboards, all of the customization stays on the keyboard itself. So that means you're not working with any drivers or plugins on your operating system. This keyboard, once you've set it up the way you want, is ready to go with any device. All you need to do is simply connect it to any machine and it will just work exactly the same way. And again, this is what's so interesting about the Voyager, because fundamentally it's a very portable keyboard, and we'll get onto that in terms of how the accessories work with that in mind in a minute. But because of that portability, it means that you can actually start more seriously thinking in terms of you using this keyboard everywhere you go, no matter which machine you're using. And that's a barrier for a lot of people. They think if they set up a big custom keyboard in their desktop environment, what are they going to do when they need something more portable? Well, this keyboard is so portable, you can just grab it and go, and then you can use your custom keyboard with any device. Now, I do realize there are kind of some situations where that just isn't going to work, where your job requires you to actually hop between different machines throughout the day and you're just stuck using the keyboard that you've got. So a custom keyboard isn't going to work for you if that's your kind of work environment, unfortunately. But I think for most people, it's actually quite feasible to think in terms of using your own keyboard, no matter which device you actually need to use it with. And this even applies to using this with things like iPads as well. Now, it's worth mentioning here that every single keyboard I've looked at on this channel, and there are now quite a few, has actually been used by me as a daily driver keyboard. So I've learned it, and I've learned to type fast enough to work with it, and I have actually lived with every single one of these throughout this journey. So what that means is when somebody offers me a keyboard to test out, I generally just say no, because I know that to test it properly, I'm going to have to actually change the layout to work with it and live with it. And that's something I don't tend to want to do very often. I'm just really focused on iterating and getting towards what I consider to be the optimum keyboard. So the keyboard I was using as my daily driver before ZSA offered me the Voyager to take a look at was my 18-key keyboard layout, and that means the alpha keys were actually split over 2 different layers. And that is fantastic for reducing overall finger movement, bringing obviously everything down to basically 2 rows, and I gave that a really good run, but ultimately it did have real accuracy issues at speed. So as I was starting to get faster with it, the error rate didn't really seem to go down, and it was very difficult to kind of combat that. Switching between 2 layers for your alpha keys through normal typing obviously introduces quite a few additional keystrokes. So that whole thing was a really fascinating experiment. I'm really glad I've done it. I learned a lot about custom keyboard layouts through that process. Very interesting to actually get up to 80 words a minute on a dual layer keyboard like that. But ultimately I was looking for something to kind of try instead of that, and moving back to a single alpha layer. So when ZSA offered to send me the Voyager, I was like, yep, let's do it. I'll go back to the idea of a proper keyboard from a real company instead of the DIY one, and see how it goes. The other issue I have quite a lot with my DIY keyboards is my soldering skills are not very good, and that means reliability was a little bit of a problem with some of those keyboards as well. So ultimately I was very happy to go back towards a keyboard from ZSA, who I know from the Moonlander and the Planck make incredible quality keyboards. I knew that all of my reliability issues would go away when I went back to a ZSA keyboard. Now, the main problem I have with commercial keyboard manufacturers making custom keyboards is how hesitant they are to embrace the smaller layouts. And I do totally get that. Of course, most people don't suddenly want to jump down to a small layout. It's just too much of a jump in terms of learning where all the keys have gone kind of thing. When you're used to the normal keyboards, which are just so huge with so many different rows and symbol layers and function rows and all of this stuff. And that, again, this is why I think the Voyager is actually a really interesting keyboard, because it is quite bold in that it is actually quite a small layout, and the thumb cluster is only 2 keys per side. So coming from my 18-key keyboard, of course, that is still quite a large layout, but compared to most other custom keyboards, especially looking at things like the Moonlander that really has a lot of keys, this is actually a very welcome move. And for me, I think the benefit in terms of portability, and actually personally preferring smaller layouts using layers rather than larger layouts using dedicated keys, this is really awesome to see. So one of the ways with custom keyboards that you can really embrace using these smaller layouts is by using home row layer switching. So that's where your home row keys can actually be set up to switch the board into a different layer. So when you hold down one of those keys, the rest of the keys on the keyboard will switch to a different layer, giving you really fast, easy access to your symbols and other characters. And that just means you don't have to think in terms of having dedicated keys for those things. And it's quite possible to set that up in a way that doesn't interrupt normal typing either. So this is the ZSA Voyager with its 52 key layout. Now I've made the point that the most keys you'd ever really need is 34. So that is essentially where every single key is only one key's distance from your home row location. And I think that is essentially true. And if they ever made a smaller ZSA Voyager with that layout, I'd be all over it. But obviously, like I said before, I understand why they're hesitant to go super small with the layout. It would obviously put a lot of people off. With this layout, I've actually really embraced the additional keys. I'm using the number row for the numbers, and I've added some keys onto those outer columns as well that I wouldn't normally be using. I think one of the things I've overlooked in this journey is the significance of a columnar layout with additional rows. I've always wanted to avoid the idea of hopping over a row to reach to another row, but I think that idea came from staggered keyboards, where it felt very hard to judge where those keys are because of the offset between the rows, whereas with a columnar keyboard, it's very easy to jump over a row knowing that all the keys are directly above the key that you're coming from. So it actually makes it very quick and easy to find that number row on a keyboard like this. Of course, I don't need to use the keys. I could easily create a custom layout and put my number keys on another layer like I'm used to using. But in actual fact, I'm finding it so enjoyable using this keyboard as a whole package in the way that it was kind of thought out, that I'm actually at the moment got no intention of doing that. So let's look at portability. So right from the beginning, I've always had this idea that whatever keyboard I'm going to come up with should be portable. I want to be able to use it with my iPad when I'm away from home, and ideally only using one keyboard, not having to buy two for the purpose. I really like having my keyboard properly tented at quite an extreme angle, and that uses tripod mounts to make that happen. So normally a tripod mount on a keyboard is obviously quite a permanent setup. You've got the thread there, and how's the mount connected to the keyboard? It's not something you can think in terms of very quickly grabbing and going off somewhere with. The Voyager changes the game here with its magnetic accessories. So this allows for the tripod mounts to fix to the bottom of the keyboard magnetically, which means the tripod mounts themselves can be screwed onto my little clamps here permanently, and the board itself just snaps on and off. And the really nice thing about that is it doesn't leave anything on the board. When you take it and you want it to be as small as possible in its pouch, there's literally nothing protruding. So the magnetic tripod mount actually sticks to the metal plate on the bottom of the keyboard, and it's completely flush, and the magnet's in the mount rather than the keyboard, so you don't get anything weird going on with the keyboard sticking to things either. And that's really significant because it means you can have a really awesome desktop setup with an elaborate tripod mount based tenting positioning system, but it makes it so easy just to snap them off the mounts, slip them into the pouch, and take the keyboard to use with my iPad when I'm staying somewhere away. If anyone's worried the magnets are not enough to hold it steady, if they're a particularly enthusiastic typer, they're not going anywhere. You have to really pry them off when you do want to take it off. There's no way normal, even very enthusiastic typing would bash these off the magnetic mounts. So the board actually comes with these little small magnetic feet that allow for a small tent on a flat desktop environment as well, and they can just snap on and off in the same way as the tripod mounts. Interestingly, while we're talking about portability, it is actually possible to use this keyboard even with a phone over Lightning. You just have to use the adapter that allows additional power to be sent to the USB port. It works just fine. Very interesting kind of idea there for an ultra minimal setup. But of course, with an iPad that's got a USB-C connector, or presumably the new phones with USB-C, it is just a question of plugging it straight in. So let's talk about the thumb keys. Now, a lot of people really like lots of thumb keys. The Moonlander is a great example of a keyboard that has a good load of thumb keys. And I've experimented with using those. For me, I've kind of settled on 2 each side being the absolute most I need in terms of thumb keys. With my 2-layer keyboard, the 18-key keyboard, the thumb keys on the right were used for switching to that second alpha layer and the caps version of the second alpha layer. So now that I'm back to a single alpha layer on this keyboard, I've got essentially 2 thumb keys on my right hand that I didn't have a need for before. And what I'm doing here is using them for command and control. So that works really nicely with shift being the second one on my left hand. I've got those main modifiers right under my thumbs, just makes it very quick to rattle off keyboard shortcuts on this keyboard. And with control being just under a thumb key, it makes it super easy to use those shortcuts in Vim as well. The main thumb key on my left hand is of course the space key, but for a long time on my custom keyboards, I've had this setup where if you hold it down, you get the meh key, which is an absolutely incredible setup when you use it with something like Keyboard Maestro on a Mac, because it allows you to set up direct application switching shortcuts just using your normal letter keys when you hold down that thumb key. It's one of the absolute best things about using a custom keyboard. Now, I mentioned having tap hold keys on your home row to switch layers. Well, a lot of people actually use that approach for their modifiers. So I'm not doing that. I've got my modifiers on my thumb keys. But you can use modifiers as tap holds on your home row as well. So if you held down, say, one of your home keys, it would give you the command key on the Mac. And then the other keys that you press down would give you the command version of that key, essentially. So it works like a normal modifier, but it is actually a normal letter key when you're just tapping it. And you can use alternate hands, of course, to use the other keys. So essentially, I think there are two kind of main routes that you can go down when you're working with a custom keyboard, and that is whether you use the thumb keys to switch layers or whether you use the thumb keys as modifiers. And there's, of course, the third option is if you use the thumb keys for things like enter and backspace, which a lot of people do as well. So from those three choices, I think you could start your custom layout journey after picking one of those routes. Of course, the downside of using thumb keys as your modifier keys means it's quite hard to actually push two of them at the same time. So that's definitely something to think about. So because I'm actually so used to having modifiers as tap holds on my upper row, I've just kept that there. So if I do need to do two at once, I'll use one on the top row and one as a thumb key, which actually works pretty well. Now let's talk a little bit about the actual position of the thumb keys on the Voyager keyboard. Now, they are at a really extreme angle from the rest of the board. And that's actually really interesting because what that does is it allows for a less aggressive stagger on the Pinkie column. So normally with custom keyboards, people sort of look at the finger length and work out that if your hand is on the keyboard, you need the Pinkie columns to come right down to allow that quick access to them. But that's kind of related to the angle of your hand across the board. So if your hand is kind of rotated that way a little bit more across the board as a result of having a thumb key arrangement like we see on the Voyager that's really aggressively angled down, then the Pinkie column can go back up a little bit. And that means the board kind of looks a little bit less weird without that aggressive Pinkie stagger that a lot of custom keyboards have. I think that's quite interesting to consider how the thumb key position is actually relevant to the amount of offset on your Pinkie columns as well. When I've been experimenting with designing my own layouts, that was something that I've kind of thought about. Another thing is that if you tuck your thumb keys right up close to the normal keys, then obviously your little finger can kind of come up a little bit further as well, because that difference can easily be accommodated in the longer fingers, but not your shorter fingers. So basically, if you're looking at the Voyager and thinking, is it enough of a Pinkie stagger for me if you're used to a custom keyboard already, then I would say consider how the implication of the thumb key position affects this. I think what they've done here with this thumb key position and the minimal Pinkie offset is actually bang on. For me, this keyboard feels absolutely perfect. Even from day one, it felt incredibly easy to actually find every key that I was aiming for. It's a very, very comfortable layout overall. I think actually it's very easy to underestimate the significance of the position of the layout here. They've done such a good job here. Now, one of the defining differences between a decent custom keyboard and like a normal kind of commercial off-the-shelf keyboard is that the key switches themselves are hot swappable. And that's the same with the Voyager. So both the keycaps and the switches underneath the keycaps can be removed from the keyboard. If you want to change the experience of the keyboard in the future, it's actually super easy just to pull out all the key switches and change them for a different kind. And that's the really interesting thing about these kinds of key switches is there are so many different options available. You can have clicky ones or super lightweight ones, or ones that you have to push quite hard with a lot of resistance in, or ones that even have a sort of tactile bump on the way down, or whether they're perfectly smooth all the way down to the bottom. And that really changes the feel of the keyboard. And with a keyboard like this with hot swappable switches, it makes it very easy to tune that into the future. For me, that journey has actually been very interesting. So I've always thought that the lighter weight key switches would be optimum for reducing effort. But there's much more to it than that, because once you add a little bit more resistance, you're used to then pushing harder, and that somehow makes it easier to push faster, or rather pushing faster results in you pushing harder. And having the extra resistance there sort of encourages that slightly more bashy approach, which actually seems to help with typing fast. But that's just me. But I think actually looking at some of the videos of the really insanely fast speed typers that are out there on YouTube, they really bash the keyboards. And that's quite interesting. It's almost like the faster you move your hands, the less the ability you have for sort of delicate movement, which kind of stands to reason. Now, when you buy one of these keyboards from ZSA, you get the choice of which key switches you want to put in it when you order it. So it's worth having a little think about what kind of key switches you want. From my perspective, having had this experience now, I would say it's actually not as simple as just going for the lightest weight ones. In fact, I didn't even realize that until ZSA actually sent me two versions of this board, one with a heavier weight key switch, and I found that I actually really liked using that heavier weight key switch. So definitely just keep all that in mind when you're working out which key switches to get. But at the end of the day, you can easily switch out those key switches later if you want to. These boards come with a special tool that makes it really easy to just take the caps off and move them around, or it can be turned around and used to take the switches out of the board as well. So the whole process is really easy. It's definitely something they're fully encouraging when you buy a keyboard like this as well. Now, one of the best things about obviously using a custom keyboard is how you can experiment with moving your keys around. And when you're learning a new layout, it can be useful to actually physically move the keycaps from one place to another, just so that you can quickly glance at it to see what your new position for a given key is. With old school mechanical keyboards, each row on the keyboard had a slightly different keycap profile, which means you couldn't move one key from one row to another. And this is really annoying. Obviously, it kind of defeats the purpose of having a custom keyboard. With the Voyager, these chock keycaps are all exactly the same flat profile, so it's no problem at all to move the keys around on the keyboard. And all but the two inner thumb keys are exactly the same size. So you can take an outer column key and move it into a thumb key and so on, and there's just no problem there moving these keys around. And what's really nice about the Voyager is it comes with a whole bunch of additional keys that you can switch in and out of your main layout. So you can have a really nice looking keyboard with all the legends looking brilliant with the RGB backlighting. We'll come on to that in a second, but without any headaches around different keycap profiles. So you can create a really great looking design on this keyboard. Now, it's worth noting that these keycaps are actually built by ZSA for this keyboard. But what's really cool about these keycaps is they're proper double shot keycaps. So what that means is the letter legend in the keycap itself is actually a translucent plastic, and that is kind of embedded in the plastic of the keycap itself. So the opaque part, the white bit or the black bit, depending on which one you get, is a different plastic to that translucent plastic. And that means nothing's going to rub off the surface of the key. It's like this all the way through. Of course, also it means that with a keyboard like this that has these incredible RGB backlights, you get that backlight shining through the legends on the keycaps. So it's a great looking board as a result of that. It's really nice to see these double shot keycaps. Now, the really brilliant thing about this custom keycap set is they include versions of the keys with the home bumps on for your common different layouts. So obviously when you switch away from QWERTY, you tend to switch between F and J being under your index fingers to two different keys, quite often T and N. That will work with a lot of custom layouts, including the one I'm using here, which is called ISRT. Basically T and N are my home keys, and I've got the T and N keys with the home bumps on here included in the set, so that's just fantastic. Now, what's brilliant about these custom keycaps is they've actually built 3 different versions of them. So you've got the standard US focused one where your number row includes the shifted version. So you see the shifted version of the number row keys in the legends on the keycaps. And then you've got this kind of international version which just shows the number keys on that number row and no symbols. And I think actually this is a great choice if you're thinking about a custom keyboard, because you never know quite what you might want to do with those symbols. You might want to move away from the idea of just using shifted numbers for symbols. And you don't necessarily want that reflected in the legends. So that's a really cool option. But for the really hardcore customization people, they do also offer a set of blanks, also actually still double shot, where you, instead of the legend, you just have this little circle to still let the RGB backlight shine through, but all the keycaps are the same with this symbol. Now, that's definitely the one to go for if you're confident in your ability to learn to touch type properly, which I think if you're using this kind of keyboard, you definitely would be and should be. And then that's the one that's going to turn heads in your office. And all 3 of these custom layouts are available in either black or white, which is really cool. And this is brilliant to see this much choice at the buying stage here as well. Now, the RGB backlighting is incredibly striking, and of course it's only really available as a result of this keyboard being a USB powered keyboard, so it can draw that power for the RGB backlighting all the time it's plugged into your computer. Now, there's a whole bunch of these incredible animated patterns that will work their way through the whole board from both halves and synchronized across, and will just look fantastic on your desk. But you can also use the RGB backlighting as part of the custom layout. So when you're in different layers, you can have different RGB colors on the keys to kind of help you get your head around those layers as well. For me, I just think the animated patterns are so cool. I just have it doing that all the time. And there are loads of different ones to choose from. And then there are some that sort of animate on a single color, and you can change the hue of that color as well. And of course you can change the brightness, or you can just turn the whole thing off if that's your choice as well. Interesting fun fact about the home bumps on these homing keys: ZSA actually moved the position of the bump slightly higher up on the key compared to other chock keycaps. And that's interesting because it is actually more under your fingertips when you're trying to find those keys. And it's those kinds of small details that I think actually you can see everywhere in the design and build of this board. So as if this package wasn't sounding exciting enough as it is, I haven't even got onto Oryx yet, which is ZSA's online tool. And that's what you use to actually create your custom layouts. You put the keys where you want, set up the layers and all the other sort of subtle small settings associated with the board. And then you can save all of that straight onto the keyboard just using Chrome itself. Now this tool is incredibly easy to use. It's obviously fully web-based and point and click simplicity here, which is a big contrast to obviously using a coded config file, which is what I'm used to using up to now using my DIY keyboards. It just makes it so easy to create a custom layout for a keyboard. It really just makes this whole package incredibly accessible to anybody who's not really used to custom keyboards, but just wants to improve the ergonomics of the keyboard they use day to day with minimal kind of overhead associated with that. It really is basically as simple as choosing a layer and then clicking on a key and saying what that key should do. And then obviously you work out how you're going to switch between those layers by setting up the layer switch holds. And everything is really easy to understand and explained at every point in this interface as well. So I think they've done an incredible job with the software side as well, which is, as always, brilliant to see a combination of good hardware and good software. Now these keyboards are actually powered by QMK underneath, and you can actually get involved with that if you want to get your hands dirty and work with custom programming as well. I don't really see that there's much need to do that because Oryx is just so powerful by itself. So I think this is a really good system all around. So we should talk a little bit about the fact that this is a wired keyboard. It has a permanent connection between the two halves and to your machine using USB-C. Now, obviously, no one really likes having wires on their desktop, and I totally get that desire for a sort of clean, wire-free, clutter-free setup. But, you know, looking at what we've got here, this is an off-the-shelf keyboard, fully supported with the software to back it up, with all the accessories, everything, all the different choices when you buy the keyboard. There's just nothing like it out there that's wireless, so it doesn't exist. Yeah, obviously it would be great if it was wireless, but you know, we know there are practical issues with that as well. So you wouldn't be able to have the always on super bright RGB backlighting, and it would be heavier with the battery. So there's obviously some pros and cons, and knowing the history of ZSA, where they've been working with QMK keyboards for a while, because QMK isn't really geared up for wireless keyboards, we can kind of see why this is the situation we're in with this keyboard. So the custom keyboards I've been building use ZMK, which is an alternative to QMK, just as the core firmware that runs the keyboard. And ZMK is obviously optimized for wireless connectivity from the outset. So my custom keyboards were actually all wireless. Now, it is a little bit annoying when those batteries run out and then you have to plug them in. I'm not actually super sad to see that go. The vast majority of the time I use these keyboards, they're on my treadmill here, so it's really not a problem for it to be permanently plugged in. And that does just avoid all of the Bluetooth connectivity issues that kind of crop up as well when you're switching between devices. So for me, I'm happy to kind of take it as it is. I think it doesn't really get in the way of the way I want to use this. For the most part, it's just here and is plugged in all of the time. And the fact that you get this amazing RGB backlighting as a result of it not being wireless. So I really don't think it's as big a deal as I think some people might think it is. So if we look at the whole package, I think this is a keyboard that finds an incredible balance between the kind of requirements of the custom keyboard community and the restraints of a kind of commercial manufacturing operation. And it just gets it very right. You know, it's a good small layout, but not too small that it's going to put people off. It has incredible software. It has incredible hardware. It basically has all the advantages of a proper custom keyboard in a way that's super accessible for someone who's not even used custom keyboards before to get into. And I think that's fantastic because it means it's essentially the only keyboard you're going to need to buy. So I think the fact that I've actually permanently switched to this keyboard as my daily driver is a real testament to how much it can offer someone who's gone all the way down this custom keyboard rabbit hole like me to actually just come straight back to something that's just off the shelf and not find it restrictive or limiting in any way is really amazing. Someone recently asked me what keyboard I would recommend them to kind of just improve ergonomics. They're not a custom keyboard enthusiast, they're just using their Apple keyboard. I didn't actually know before the Voyager was released. I wasn't sure really what to suggest, but obviously now this is on the market. The answer is obviously this. They would just have to just plug it in, tweak the layout a little bit. They'd stick with QWERTY, of course. It wouldn't take them too long to learn the Columnar layout and get used to the thumb positions and so on. And they'd be really immediately enjoying that improved ergonomics of a proper tenting keyboard with the split and all the rest of it. So really this is the only keyboard anyone needs, and I think if you use a computer, just buy one of these. It's that simple. It will transform your experience working with computers. In fact, I would say this is arguably the best keyboard in the world for those reasons. It's also worth mentioning at this point, I'm not being paid by ZSA. They sent me this keyboard and I can keep it. That's as far as it goes. They haven't said I need to say anything or do anything. They don't get to see this video. These are just my own opinions. I've always liked ZSA keyboards. The Planck and the Moonlander were the two keyboards that I sort of started this keyboard journey on. And then I obviously went down the custom DIY rabbit hole. And now I've come back to using the Voyager. But this is absolutely just my honest opinion on this board. If you want some more inspiration on designing custom layouts, which could easily work on this Voyager keyboard, you should watch this one next, where I look at a 34-key layout, but it obviously includes lots of different tips and tricks that you could apply to designing a custom layout for a keyboard like this as well. And I'll see you there.